People may remember this wild footage from back in January out of Ecuador. We can roll up this first VO here. This was a group of gangs. A gang leader was broken out of prison in Ecuador. The climax of this wild insanity that you're looking at here is these gang members taking over a TV station live on air, holding people hostage, and really putting an exclamation mark on what had become an extraordinary kind of devolution in Ecuador from one of the safest countries in South America to basically what is drifting towards a narco state run by kind of U.S.-backed gangs at this point. Now, that brings us to just last Thursday, there was this remarkable moment on the international stage where you had Ecuadorian forces burst into the Mexican embassy. So this footage was released yesterday by Mexico. These are kind of basically Ecuadorian stormtroopers here outside the embassy, busting their way in here. They're looking for the former vice president. They run into embassy staff, as you see here, top officials there, throwing old diplomats down onto the ground, and dragging out the former vice president who had been formally offered asylum by the Mexican government. It's hard to describe a greater breach of international norms other than perhaps an airstrike on an embassy, as happened in Damascus quite recently. Now, the U.S. Took 2 days to respond with a very modest statement where they didn't even condemn. The headline on their statement was "Events at the Embassy of Mexico in Ecuador." Then they said the United States condemns any violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. So just generally condemning, but they never go on to specifically condemn what had just happened. This is 48 hours earlier, bear in mind. And then they write, Mexico and Ecuador are crucial partners of the United States, and we place a high value on our relations with both countries. We encourage the two countries to resolve their differences in accord with international norms. So really taking a hands-off approach there. They continued to be under pressure to say something about what their U.S.-backed government had done in Quito. And so Jake Sullivan yesterday came out at the White House press briefing, and this is how he addressed it finally.
I also want to take a moment before going to your questions to address the events of April 5th in Quito, Ecuador. We condemn this violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, including the use of force against embassy officials. We've reviewed the security camera footage from the Mexican embassy and believe these actions were wrong. The Ecuadorian government disregarded its obligations under international law as a host state to respect the inviolability of diplomatic missions and jeopardized the foundation of basic diplomatic norms and relationships.
The backdrop of all of this is quite interesting. If we can put up this fourth VO here, this is former National Assemblyman Ronnie Aliaga, who you're looking at here, who has created a huge stir in Ecuador over the past several weeks by releasing text messages between him and Diana Salazar, who is the U.S.-backed Attorney General in Ecuador. It was Salazar who issued the arrest warrant against the former vice president, and before Daniel Noboa issued the order to carry it out inside the embassy. And what Aliaga has been saying is that the text messages between him and her confirm that she and the U.S. ambassador have been working hand in glove on various prosecutions and political interventions over the past several years, and that Salazar is effectively kind of the U.S.'s closest ally inside Ecuador and is being groomed for the presidency. What we can add to this, I've spoken to the former National Assemblyman for several hours over the past couple of weeks, and he passed on to me. We can put this up on the screen here. A forensic analysis of his two phones, because there's a lot of speculation in Ecuador that he is making this entire thing up. So he basically allowed a Miami-based firm to have access to his phones, and they confirmed that in fact these text messages between him and the number that appears to belong to Salazar are in fact accurate. So to kind of give us more background on all of this is former foreign minister of Ecuador, Guillame Long. Guillame Long is joining us from, like much of the government of Rafael Correa, of exile. And so, first of all, Foreign Minister Long, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for the invitation. I'm not formally in exile, but I certainly don't live in Ecuador right now, unlike many of my former colleagues who are in exile, who enjoy political asylum in a number of countries, actually, Mexico being one, which we'll discuss with you, Argentina also, but also Belgium, where former President Correa himself has been granted political asylum. It's not my case, but I don't live in Ecuador at the moment.
Would you feel safe going back to Ecuador at this point, or do you think that the kind of persecution of your party is so broad that there might be some risk?
Yeah, I mean, I've been going back to Ecuador. I went back in the most recent elections in October 2023. I was also there in August 2023. I've been going back regularly, and I have family in Ecuador, so I do go back. But and was better for a while. It's gotten significantly worse now again. There was a lull a little bit, but yeah, I mean, for a few years I did not go back, and it has been unsafe, largely speaking, for Ecuadorians because of the general security situation in Ecuador, but also for obviously the political left. Yeah, there are lots. I mean, the deep state is very active and very noticeable if you've been part of the Correa government at some point in time. Yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about Jorge Glas, the former vice president who was dragged out of the Mexican embassy. You know, what's behind these charges, and what do we know about his safety? Because as I understand it, the Americans privately did finally tell the Ecuadorian government that he ought not to be harmed while in prison. We'll see, you know, how effective that is.
Yeah, so the story of persecution in Ecuador is a long and complicated one, which I'm not going to go into many details about. But the big pivotal moment is when Lenín Moreno becomes president in 2017, elected on a continuity ticket after Correa. He had been a former vice president of Correa. Then he betrays that and does a U-turn, sides with the Trump administration, does all the things that many of us know about, you know, throws Assange out of the London embassy, brings Pompeo and Mike Pence to Quito, and then signs loads of deals, including an IMF deal, grants an airstrip in the Galapagos to the Pentagon and Southcom and so on, really realigns geopolitically within the sphere of the United States and within the sphere of the Trump administration, right? And then he organizes a referendum in 2018, which is the big problem till this day. So I'm just going to say a quick word about this. The referendum, while he was still popular, a few months later he would have lost it, and he ended his term as the most unpopular president in Ecuadorian history. This is Lenín Moreno. But when he had held the referendum, he was still in his honeymoon, and supported by the media, managed to pass this referendum. And there were a few questions. One of them was to bar re-election so that Correa could never be president again. But the other crucial question was to do an overhaul of the judiciary, if you like, to purge the judiciary. The government, Moreno government, actually called it a de-Correaization, if you like. It's a Spanish term, but to de-Correaize, Correaize, as the president, the Ecuadorian state. And so you have to purge all the Correísta elements of the Ecuadorian state, and that includes the judiciary. And then he managed to name a series of new, very diehard anti-Correa judges, who then started the persecution. And this was a persecution that was essentially carried out in 2019 and 2020, in part against Jorge Glas, who ended up in jail. He purged 6 years in jail. And another one, a big case involving several people, including President Correa himself, who got an 8-year jail sentence. But because he was already living abroad in Belgium, the Belgian government, seeing that the actual sentence says Correa was guilty of psychic influence over others to commit crimes, right? This is actually in the sentence. So the Belgian government eventually gave Correa political asylum based on the fact that there was a clear case of political persecution. Interpol also denied several arrests, red alerts they're called, for the arrest of Correa. And so internationally, the case crumbled, if you like. But domestically, in Ecuador, they doubled down on this. And there is an arrest warrant for Correa, for several other people. And Glas, because he was in jail, they managed to start, as soon as he was freed, they managed to start a new case, which is even more ludicrous than the other. This essentially has to do with reconstruction funds after the earthquake of 2016. Ecuador had a terrible earthquake in 2016, and Glas was as vice president, was in charge of the reconstruction. And they're saying he used those funds not for reconstruction, which, okay, he headed a committee, and those funds were actually used for economic dynamism, to stimulate the growth and so on and so forth. So that's not strictly reconstruction. So they're not even accusing him of stealing money. They're accusing him of not using the funds for reconstruction, but for something else, which was also public policy. So the whole case is a sham. So he saw that it was a new sham, and so he sought asylum in the Mexican embassy. There have been a number of Ecuadorian, particularly former Correa collaborators, former ministers, so on and so forth, seeking asylum in a Mexican embassy over the last few years. Several of them were granted safe passage during the previous administrations to enjoy their political asylum. That's the technical term, to be able to reach Mexico and enjoy their political asylum there. But this time, under Noboa, Ecuador refused to grant the safe passage, and in fact, as we saw this weekend, quite dramatically, stormed the embassy, which is a massive violation, we could talk about this, of Article 22 of the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which is really the ground floor of international law, right? It is the convention that establishes, before any other agreement on international law is made, how we're going to interact between states, what are the essential rules of the game of diplomacy. You have an embassy in my country, I have one in yours, we can't touch those. It's kind of common sense. Everybody knows that. Anybody who's watched the kind of an action movie knows that you don't storm the embassy, right? It's pretty common sense. But they violated that. And it's one of the few times it's ever been done in Latin American history. So it's very traumatic. And right now, Ecuador is very isolated.
So actually on that, I know Ryan has questions about Vienna, but I also wanted to ask, for people in the States trying to put these puzzle pieces together, there's this question of why is AMLO involved to this degree? And obviously the big picture context about crime and cartels and COVID and poverty and all of that sort of comes together, and AMLO's relationship with Correa and with the sort of exiled former Correa allies. Can you tell us a little bit about maybe what's in it for AMLO, why AMLO and Mexico are involved to the degree that they're involved, and maybe how that speaks to that big picture question of Noboa and Bukele and a lot of Latin American politics kind of in general?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I mean, it's AMLO, but it's also Mexico. Mexico has a long history of being this sort of land for asylum seekers, right? So it played a key role in the 1954 Caracas Convention on Asylum, which is sort of a piece of international law that Latin Americans are quite proud of, Latin American diplomats are quite proud of, because it was a precursor law in international law that Latin Americans drafted in the inter-American system to protect asylum seekers. And it was key in a number of ways to establish the rules, what the rules of political asylum are. So Mexico played a big role in that. But then in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, in the sort of heyday of military dictatorship, particularly in the Southern Cone, Mexico was the land of exile, of political asylum of the opponents that were being persecuted by all these Cold War, US-backed largely, military regimes. So Mexico became famous as a sort of safe haven. It never did have the military regimes that other countries in Latin America had. And so Mexico's kind of got this kind of prestige. There's also something called the Estrada Doctrine, which is a doctrine of a former foreign minister of Mexico that has a big impact on the doctrine of Mexican foreign policy, but the foreign policy of other Latin American states. So there's a whole sort of Mexican, I would say almost institutional culture of international law and asylum law, which is symbolic here. And it kind of had been a little bit abandoned in the last 10, 20 years. And Mexico, after joining NAFTA, stopped sort of being seen like this. And AMLO really insisted on bringing back this sort of age-old tradition of Mexico being a land of asylum. And when you had during the Trump years, this kind of conservative backlash in Latin America, including coups like in Bolivia, like where did people seek refuge? Where did people hide? People who had been part of Evo Morales' cabinet, so on. They went to the Mexican embassy. Actually, they went to the Mexican and the Spanish embassy in the Bolivian case. And in Ecuador, when Moreno started persecuting the left there, same. They went to the Mexican embassy. And AMLO eventually granted people asylum, and a number of people asylum. Right now, Mexico is the place where there is the greatest number of Ecuadorian refugees. There is some in Argentina. As just said, President Correa himself is in Belgium. But lots of people, lots of former ministers are in Mexico. So Glas went to the Mexican embassy. This seemed to be the logical sort of place to go to. And yeah, I think it speaks of two things. So answering your question, one is Mexican tradition. The other is AMLO, who's kind of on the political left, so there may be some sympathies there, but I think it's more of a political left that wanted to revive this age-old Mexican tradition, right? And to go back to the Estrada doctrine I've just mentioned. The other element is, of course, the geopolitical context, with since 2015, 2016, a sort of rightward shift in the hemisphere, which is less aggressive now because Bolsonaro's not there anymore, and there have been a few victories for the left in Colombia and Honduras and Chile, elsewhere. But there was, 2015, 2016, a big pendular shift to the right, and an authoritarian right, which persecuted people, which meant there were suddenly, just as you had in the 60s and 70s, Mexico playing that role again.
And let me ask you about these charges that have been leveled by Rani Aliaga in his conversations with me, and also in these videos that have gone viral inside Ecuador. One of the charges he made is related to the assassination of Fernando Villavicencio. People will remember probably that we covered this. This was the presidential candidate, kind of anti-corruption crusader who was assassinated right after a rally as he's walking to his car. People probably remember seeing that footage. What Aliaga says is that Diana Salazar, the Attorney General, told him that she had a dinner with the U.S. ambassador, and the U.S. ambassador told her that they had 3 field offices working on this because Villavicencio was a high-level kind of U.S. informer, U.S. asset, and that they were putting out a $5 million reward for any information leading to his killing, and that they knew their investigation had already uncovered the fact that it was the Los Lobos gang that was behind his assassination. These are narco traffickers. But that Correa's party was surging in the elections. The first round was coming in 2 weeks, and that it would not be good to get that information out because at the time, the Ecuadorian media was blaming Correa and Correa's party for this assassination. And so it's better to allow that to play out. Rather than give a gift to the left, heading into the election. Noboa does end up then winning a very tight election in the second round, against Correa's party. So what do you make of these allegations from Aliaga, and how seriously are they being taken in Ecuador?
So these allegations, which are just coming out, and they seem to be certified by this US-based verification, IT verification outfit, which is going to be very important because he's going to have the proof that this is legitimate. They're going to, they're only just starting to play out now, and because of what's just happened in the Mexican embassy in Ecuador, this kind of news cycle is focused on that. But I think once the story is out and once it hits the mainstream press, including outside Ecuador, it's going to have a huge impact because they confirm a lot of our suspicions and a lot of the accusations that were leveled at Salazar back then and have been leveled at Salazar back. So that's the sort of equivalent of the Attorney General in Ecuador, Fiscal General, we say in Ecuador, the Prosecutor General, if you like, who did not prosecute and did not accelerate investigation before the elections, as you just said, because it would have deflected attention or accusations away from Correísmo. And Correísmo was ahead in the poll, and she's been the arch persecutor of Correísmo and the left in Ecuador in the last few years. So it's extremely serious, but it would mean that the Prosecutor General, the Attorney General, would have acted in a politicized way, would have decided to not investigate a crime and who the authors of that crime are, or at least delay it for political purposes, so that Correísmo would get the would get accused of this crime during elections. And bearing in mind that Villavicencio was an arch opponent of Correísmo, sort of one of those kind of very, sort of played the role of a whistleblower, and sort of a very, on the media, constantly sort of throwing accusations, pretty much against everybody. He was that kind of character. And he was, we always suspected, supported by the United States. We're now going to see whether there's any more evidence for this, but this was kind of vox populi, right? It was the rumor everywhere in the political circles that Villavicencio was essentially a US agent. Whether that's exactly true or not, or whether he was supported in some way or another, we're going to find out. And then when he was murdered, when he was assassinated, in something which really hurt Ecuadorian democracy and the Ecuadorian elections, right? Because he was a presidential candidate. And this is the first time in contemporary history that you have a presidential candidate that's murdered in Ecuador. I mean, he wouldn't have won the elections. It didn't change the outcome. Well, it did in a way, but it's not as if, was leading the polls. He was, depending on different polls, in 4th, 5th place, 6th place, whatever. But it was still traumatic. This was a crucial sort of, it was a well-known politician in Ecuador who was running for the presidency who was murdered. And there are lots of suspicions at the time that his murder was politically motivated in order to hurt Correísmo, that because he was such sort of an arch critic of Correísmo, because he was, constantly throwing accusations of Correísmo, the natural conclusion of that would be that it was Correísmo that had him murdered, which so you see after his murder, which was on the 9th of August, I believe, yes, in the election.
Yeah.
20th of August, you see between the 9th and the 20th of August a decline of the leading candidacy of the Correísta candidate, the left-wing candidate. She, Luisa Gonzalez, lost probably 7, 8, 9, whatever points. She might have made it without the need for a runoff, without the assassination. Did recuperate a few points right towards the end, when it became clearer and clearer that this was not that there was more and more evidence showing that it was a sort of deep state narco plot that had nothing to do with Correísmo. So, I mean, I think it significantly changed the results of the elections. We don't know what would have happened. It's very difficult to establish counterfactual here, but certainly it's very, very serious if judicial authorities in Ecuador decided not to investigate this crime or to delay the investigation of the crime in order to prejudice a candidacy. So it was a massive judicial wrongdoing and intervention in the electoral process, in democracy essentially. And if the US supported this, if the State Department or its US representatives in Ecuador supported this, it is extremely serious. And it appears from the preliminary information that we have that the Prosecutor General, in these chats with the former member of Congress, Ronnie Aliaga, is saying that she was backed, supported, encouraged by US diplomats to do this.
That does indeed appear to be what the chats say. And as I've said, the Miami-based forensic firm confirms that these chats are authentic. There was for people who were confused about why that would be needed. There's this app called Confide used down in South America, which you can pay a little extra to get it so that as soon as you press the button, the message goes away. You read it, and boom, it's gone. And so people in Ecuador have said, there's no way he has these, because they were communicating via Confide. And as he showed me, he always carries 2 phones. So he would film himself reading the message. And so he has the film of all those messages, and he sent basically the metadata and the guts of both of those phones to the Miami-based firm to confirm that his story actually does line up, that is what he did. We'll continue to follow the story because, as you said, the U.S. involvement here is extraordinarily profound and crucial. And the result has been basically a collapsing of the state and society of Ecuador. But Guillame, looking forward to have you on again, and we'll continue to follow this. Thanks so much for joining us.
No, thank you very much. Pleasure.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.